Camp Perry, Ohio, June 1945. The war in Europe had ended 3 weeks earlier, but the scars remained everywhere in bombed cities across the Atlantic, in soldiers who would never come home, in children who had learned to kill before they learned to shave. Inside the wire fence, 17 German boys stood in the summer heat, faces hollow, eyes old beyond their years. The youngest was 14. The oldest had just turned 17. They had fought in the final desperate defense of Berlin, firing weapons bigger than they were. Now an American sergeant approached carrying something they had never seen before, vanilla ice cream in paper cups. What happened next would break every heart in that camp. They were called the Volkssturm in the war's final months, the People's Storm, a last desperate mobilization of anyone who could hold a weapon. Old men and young boys pressed into service when Germany's military had been ground to dust by years of war. These 17 had been captured in the rubble of Berlin during the final assault, found in cellars and bombed-out buildings, still clutching rifles they barely knew how to use. The youngest was a boy named Klaus Zimmermann, 14 years old, who had been drafted into service 3 months before the surrender. He had been given a uniform too large, a rifle too heavy, and orders to defend a city that was already lost. He had seen things no child should see, done things that would haunt him for decades, survived by instinct and luck when skill and training failed. The oldest, Hans Bergmann, had just turned 17 when the regime made its final call for defenders. He had actually wanted to fight, had believed the propaganda that promised victory even as Allied forces closed from all directions. He had believed because the alternative, accepting that everything his country had fought for was lost, felt impossible to comprehend. Between these two extremes sat 15 other boys, each with their own story of conscription, survival, and capture. Some came from families that had supported the regime with fervent belief. Others came from homes where parents whispered doubts behind closed doors. But all had been shaped by years of propaganda, by education that taught them certain truths about the world, about their nation, about who deserved life and who deserved conquest. Now they sat in Camp Perry, a prisoner of war facility on the shore of Lake Erie, trying to understand what came next. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Their families were scattered or gone, their cities destroyed, their entire understanding of the world inverted by defeat so total it seemed impossible. The journey to America had taken weeks, cargo ships loaded with prisoners making slow progress across an Atlantic that still held dangers despite Germany's surrender. The boys were kept separate from adult prisoners, grouped together in holds where guards could monitor them constantly. There was concern they might be indoctrinated beyond redemption, that youth made them either more dangerous or more vulnerable, depending on who was making the assessment. During the crossing, Klaus rarely spoke. He had stopped talking much after Berlin, after watching the city burn and collapse around him, after seeing people do desperate things to survive the final days. His silence worried some guards and impressed others. Was it trauma or defiance? The truth was simpler and more complicated. He didn't have words for what he felt, so he said nothing. Hans, by contrast, remained vocal and angry. He insisted the regime would rise again, that the defeat was temporary, that forces were already gathering to reverse what had happened. The guards let him talk, recognizing his words as the last gasps of propaganda competing with reality. They had seen it before in other young prisoners, this desperate clinging to beliefs even as evidence mounted against them. A guard named Corporal James Mitchell had been assigned to this group of boys. He was 23, had fought through France and Germany, had seen enough of war to last several lifetimes. Looking at these German children, he felt something complicated. They had fought for a regime that committed atrocities, but they were also clearly victims of that same regime, shaped and used and discarded by powers they had barely understood. One evening during the crossing, Mitchell sat near where the boys were allowed on deck for fresh air. Klaus stood at the rail, staring at waves that rolled away into darkness, and Mitchell approached carefully. "You speak English?" Mitchell asked. Klaus shook his head. Mitchell tried broken German, learned from other prisoners. "How old?" Klaus held up fingers. 14. Mitchell felt something tighten in his chest. 14. The same age as his youngest brother back in Ohio, a kid who worried about baseball games and school dances, whose biggest concern was whether he would make the varsity team next year. "The war is over," Mitchell said, not sure if Klaus understood. "You're going to be okay." Klaus looked at him with eyes that suggested he didn't believe anything would ever be okay again. Camp Perry sat on the shore of Lake Erie, originally built as a training facility, but converted to house prisoners as the war's end brought thousands of captives to American soil. The facility was clean, well-maintained. Nothing like the camps these boys had heard about in propaganda that warned of American cruelty and torture. When they arrived in early June, Ohio was experiencing the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and close. The boys were processed through intake medical examinations, documentation, assignment to barracks. Many were malnourished. All showed signs of recent trauma. Several had wounds from combat that had healed poorly. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel Robert Hayes, had specific instructions regarding these young prisoners. They were to be housed separately from adult POWs, given educational opportunities, and treated with an eye toward rehabilitation rather than just detention. The Army had recognized that these were children shaped by circumstances beyond their control, and that how America treated them now would matter for whatever came after. The boys were assigned to Barrack 7, a low wooden structure that could house 20 prisoners comfortably. Each had a cot, a locker, and a small window that looked out toward the lake. After years of cellars and trenches, after the crossing and cargo holds, this felt almost luxurious despite being a prison. That first evening, they gathered in the barracks' common room, while Colonel Hayes addressed them through an interpreter. He explained the camp rules, the work they would be expected to do, the education programs available. He told them the war was over, that they would eventually be repatriated, that their treatment here would be fair and humane. Hans stood up and interrupted in German, his voice sharp with defiance. The interpreter translated, "We are soldiers of Germany. We do not recognize this defeat. We will escape and return to fight." Hayes regarded the boy with something between pity and concern. Through the interpreter, he responded, "You are children who were used by adults who should have protected you. Whether you accept that now or later is up to you. But while you're here, you will be treated with dignity, and you will be expected to behave accordingly." The days at Camp Perry followed a routine that was simultaneously comforting and disorienting. The boys woke at dawn, cleaned their barracks, ate breakfast in the mess hall, then spent mornings doing light work around the facility, gardening, maintenance, laundry. Afternoons were reserved for education. English lessons, American history, mathematics, science taught by teachers brought in specifically for this purpose. The food was the first thing that began breaking through their defenses. After years of wartime rations, after months of near starvation during Berlin's siege, they were given 3 full meals a day: meat, vegetables, bread with butter, milk to drink, quantities that seemed impossible after years of deprivation. Klaus gained 10 pounds in the first 2 weeks. His face began filling out, the sharp angles of starvation softening into something closer to the childhood he had been denied. He still rarely spoke, but he ate with focused intensity, as if making up for every meal he had missed. The guards at Camp Perry were an interesting mix. Some were combat veterans like Mitchell, men who had seen the war firsthand and carried complicated feelings about their German prisoners. Others were older soldiers who had been stationed stateside throughout the conflict, men who viewed the prisoners as objects of curiosity more than enemies. Mitchell found himself drawn to this group of boys, despite his better judgment. He recognized trauma when he saw it, recognized it because he carried his own version. Nights when the sound of artillery still echoed in dreams, mornings when he woke unsure where he was. These German kids wore their trauma differently than American soldiers, but the marks were the same. One afternoon, Mitchell found Klaus sitting alone near the fence line, watching Lake Erie stretch away toward the horizon. He approached and sat nearby, not speaking, just sharing the space. After several minutes, Klaus spoke in halting English he was learning in classes. "Where is family?" Klaus asked. "Ohio," Mitchell answered. "About 2 hours from here. Farm country. They are safe?" "Yes, safe. The war didn't touch America like it touched Europe." Klaus nodded slowly, processing this. "My family is Berlin." Was Berlin. "I don't know if they are alive." The grammar was broken, but the meaning clear. Mitchell felt the weight of it, this child not knowing if his parents, siblings, grandparents had survived the destruction of his city. "We can try to find out," Mitchell offered. "The Red Cross is working to connect families." "Maybe." Klaus looked at the lake. "Maybe is better to not know." The idea came from an unlikely source. Major Sarah Caldwell had been assigned to Camp Perry as a psychological counselor, tasked with assessing the mental state of prisoners and recommending treatment or rehabilitation approaches. She had been observing the German boys for 3 weeks, noting their behaviors, their interactions. Their gradual emergence from the shell's trauma had built around them. One evening, Caldwell approached Colonel Hayes with a proposal that seemed simple, but carried layers of psychological strategy. "Ice cream," she said. Hayes looked up from his paperwork. "I'm sorry?" "These boys have been living in deprivation for years. They've been taught to expect cruelty from Americans. They're holding on to their defenses because that's all they have left. What if we gave them something purely good, with no strings attached, no ulterior motive? Something that's just a gift?" "Ice cream," Hayes repeated, understanding dawning. "It's innocent. It's American. It's something they've probably never experienced. It's not military, not political, not propaganda. It's just kindness." Hayes considered this. The camp had a small commissary that could order supplies. Ice cream was certainly possible, if unusual. "And you think this will accomplish what, exactly?" "I think it might let them be children again, just for a moment. And that moment might be the crack that lets everything else through, the recognition that they were used, that the propaganda was lies, that there's a different way to exist in the world." Hayes approved the request. 2 days later, a truck arrived at Camp Perry carrying supplies from town, including 10 gallons of vanilla ice cream packed in ice. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-June, a kind of day where heat hung heavy and thick, where the lake offered no breeze, where soldiers and prisoners alike moved slowly through routines made sluggish by temperature. The boys had finished their work assignments and were in the recreation yard, a fenced area with benches and a few tables where they could spend free time. Mitchell and 3 other guards carried the ice cream out in large containers, along with paper cups and wooden spoons. The boys watched with confused suspicion as the guards set everything on tables in the yard center. Colonel Hayes was there, along with Major Caldwell and several other officers. Through the interpreter, Hayes addressed the assembled boys. "We thought you might like something cold on a hot day. This is ice cream, a frozen dessert. It's sweet, it's cold, and it's yours. No work required, no conditions attached. Just something we thought you'd enjoy." The boys looked at each other, uncertain. Was this a test? A trick? Years of propaganda had taught them to expect cruelty from Americans. Yet 3 weeks at Camp Perry had shown them only fairness. This disconnect created paralysis. They didn't know which belief to trust. Hans remained defiant. "We don't want your charity. We don't want anything from you." But Klaus stepped forward slowly, drawn by curiosity stronger than his suspicion. He approached the table where Mitchell stood ready with a scoop. Up close, Klaus could see the ice cream, white and cold, releasing vapor in the warm air. He had never seen anything like it. Mitchell scooped ice cream into a paper cup and handed it to Klaus, showing him the wooden spoon. "It's cold," Mitchell warned in broken German. "Eat slow." Klaus took the cup, feeling the cold through the paper. He looked at the ice cream, at Mitchell, at the other guards, watching with expressions he couldn't quite read. Then he put the wooden spoon into the frozen substance and lifted a small amount to his mouth. The cold hit first, shocking against lips that had never felt anything like it. Then the sweetness, intense and pure in a way that seemed almost obscene after years of bland rations. The texture was smooth, melting on his tongue, turning from solid to liquid to taste that filled his entire mouth. Klaus's eyes went wide, his breath caught, and then, without warning or conscious decision, he began to cry. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire thin frame. He stood there in the middle of the recreation yard, holding the cup of ice cream, and wept with an intensity that seemed to pull something fundamental from inside him. The other boys stared. The guards froze, uncertain what was happening or what to do. Mitchell started to move forward, concerned something was wrong, but Major Caldwell put a hand on his arm and shook her head. Let it happen. Klaus cried for everything. For the innocence he had lost in Berlin's rubble. For the terror of combat he had never been prepared to face. For the hunger that had gnawed at him for years. For his family scattered or gone. For the childhood he would never have. For the lies he had believed and the truth he was only now beginning to understand. He cried because the ice cream was sweet and cold and good, and those simple qualities represented a world he didn't know could exist. A world where adults gave children treats instead of rifles, where enemies showed kindness, where propaganda's promises of American cruelty dissolved in the face of frozen vanilla. One by one, the other boys approached the table. They took their cups of ice cream with hands that trembled slightly. They tasted sweetness and cold and possibility. And one by one, they too began to cry. Hans was the last to approach. He stood apart, watching his comrades weep, his face a mask of conflicted emotion. Pride fought with desire. Defiance battled exhaustion. Finally, he stepped forward, took a cup from Mitchell's hands, and tasted ice cream for the first time in his life. His face crumpled. The defiance that had sustained him through capture and transport in 3 weeks of imprisonment shattered like glass. He sat down heavily, on a bench cup in hand, and wept for the boy he had been before the regime taught him to hate, for the future that had been stolen from him, for the recognition that everything he had believed was built on lies. The guards stood witness to this moment, and many found tears on their own cheeks. Mitchell pulled off his glasses and wiped his eyes, not ashamed of his response, but overwhelmed by it. Corporal Davis, who had fought across Europe and thought himself hardened beyond such reactions, turned away to compose himself. Even Colonel Hayes, a career officer who had seen almost everything the war could offer, felt his throat tighten. Major Caldwell watched with professional attention, noting reactions, observing the breakthrough she had hoped for, but never quite expected to be this total. The ice cream had done what no amount of re-education or propaganda debunking could have. Accomplished, it had reached past their defenses to the children underneath, to the fundamental human capacity for joy that war had tried to crush but couldn't quite kill. For 20 minutes, the recreation yard at Camp Perry was filled with the sound of 17 German boys crying while eating ice cream. Guards stood by, some weeping themselves, all bearing witness to something they would remember for the rest of their lives, the moment when children remembered they were children, when enemies became simply boys who had suffered too much, when frozen vanilla dissolved the last defenses that propaganda had built. That evening, the boys gathered in their barracks common room with a different energy than before. Something had shifted, broken open, allowed to breathe. Klaus sat next to Hans, the youngest and the oldest, and they talked quietly in German about what had happened. Hans spoke first, his voice raw from crying. "I don't understand why they would be kind to us." "Maybe," Klaus said slowly, working through thoughts and words he was only learning to access. "Maybe the propaganda was wrong about Americans. Maybe it was wrong about many things." This was a dangerous thought, not physically dangerous anymore, but psychologically treacherous. If the propaganda was wrong about Americans, what else had been lies? If enemies could show kindness, what did that say about everything they had been taught? The implications cascaded outward, threatening to undermine every foundation their worldview was built upon. A boy named Ernst, 15 years old, had been captured defending a railway station outside Berlin. He spoke up from across the room. "My father told me, before I was conscripted, that I should remember something. He said that people are people first, and enemies second. That whatever happened in the war, I should try to remember that. The regime would have called that defeatism," Hans said, but without the edge his voice had carried before. "The regime lost," Ernst replied simply. Maybe defeatism was just reality. Mitchell stopped by the barracks during evening rounds and found the boys still awake, still talking. Through the interpreter, who was learning to be unnecessary as their English improved, they asked him questions. Why did the guards give them ice cream? Was it normal in America? Did American children eat it often? Did he have brothers, sisters, children of his own? Mitchell answered as honestly as he could. Ice cream was common in America, a treat but not a rarity. American children ate it regularly, especially in summer. He had a younger brother, about Klaus's age, safe at home on a farm in Ohio. He didn't have children of his own yet, but after the war, after seeing what he'd seen, he thought about what kind of father he wanted to be, someone who gave children ice cream, not rifles. "I want to tell you something," Mitchell said, choosing his words carefully while the interpreter translated. "What happened to you wasn't your fault. You were children when this war started. Adults made decisions that led to all of this suffering, and then they handed you weapons and told you to fight for mistakes you didn't make. The ice cream wasn't charity or pity. It was us trying to give you one moment of what childhood should have been sweet. Cold, simple, good." Klaus spoke in halting English. "Thank you for seeing us, not as enemy, as boys." "That's what you are," Mitchell said. "That's what you've always been. Just boys who deserved better than what you got." The weeks following the ice cream incident saw changes ripple through Barrack 7. The boys engaged more actively with their English lessons, asked questions about American history and government, showed curiosity about the country that held them captive. The defensive walls that had made them rigid and resistant began softening. Hans, who had been the most vocal in his defiance, became the most engaged in learning. He asked Mitchell to recommend books, to explain democratic government, to help him understand how the regime had manipulated his beliefs. The unlearning was painful. He had to confront his own complicity, his willing acceptance of propaganda, his enthusiasm for a cause that had led to such destruction. One afternoon, Hans approached Major Caldwell during her regular visits to the barracks. Through the interpreter, he asked, "How do I forgive myself for believing?" Caldwell considered this carefully before responding. "You were taught those beliefs by people in authority, people you had every reason to trust. Children believe what they're taught. The question isn't how you forgive yourself for believing then, but what you choose to believe now that you know the truth." "I believed we were superior," Hans said quietly. "I believed we had the right to conquer others. I believed terrible things about people who are ... He struggled to find words. "Who are just people." "Yes," Caldwell acknowledged. "And now you're learning differently. That learning, that willingness to change, that matters. You can't undo what you believed before, but you can become someone different going forward." Klaus found his voice during these weeks. His English improved rapidly, and he began speaking more in both German and his new language. He wrote letters to the Red Cross, trying to locate his family in Berlin's ruins. He attended every educational session offered, hungry for knowledge that wasn't filtered through propaganda's distortions. He also formed an unlikely friendship with Mitchell. The guard and the prisoner would sit together during recreation time, Mitchell teaching Klaus American phrases and Klaus teaching Mitchell more German. They talked about their lives before the war, about their families, about what they hoped would come after. "Will you hate Germans forever?" Klaus asked one day. Mitchell thought about this. "I don't think I ever hated Germans. I hated what the regime did, the decisions its leaders made, the war they started. But individual people? No. How could I hate you? You're just a kid who got caught up in something terrible. Many Germans did terrible things." "Yes," Mitchell agreed. "And those people will have to answer for that. But you? You were 14 when this ended, Klaus. 14. You deserve a chance to grow up into someone good." Camp. Perry's education program for the young prisoners was extensive and intentional. The Army had recognized that these boys would eventually return to Germany, and what they took back with them mattered for whatever society would emerge from the ruins. American history was taught with unflinching honesty. The instructors didn't present America as perfect or flawless. They taught about slavery, about the Civil War, about ongoing struggles with discrimination and inequality. But they also taught about the Constitution, about checks and balances on power, about the idea that government should serve the people rather than the other way around. The contrast with what the boys had been taught was stark. They had learned that strong leaders ruled by will and force, that democracy was weak and inefficient, that certain people were simply better than others by nature. Now they learned about systems designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, about the messiances and strength of democratic debate, about ideals that claimed all people had inherent worth regardless of birth. One instructor, Professor Martin Herschel, was particularly effective with these German boys. He had fled Germany in the 1930s, had watched from abroad as his homeland descended into dictatorship and war. He taught them in fluent German, but more importantly, he taught them as someone who understood the culture they came from and the transformation it had undergone. "You were taught lies," Herschel told them during one class session. Not small lies about minor things, but fundamental lies about human nature, about society, about who deserves life and dignity. Those lies were designed to make you believe that conquest and domination were natural and right. But here's the truth. Human societies work best when they're built on cooperation, when they recognize the worth of every individual, when power is distributed and checked rather than concentrated and absolute. Hans raised his hand. "But didn't the strong always rule throughout history? Isn't that just reality?" "The strong have often ruled," Herschel agreed. "But that doesn't make it right or inevitable. Human history is also full of people working together, building communities, creating systems of justice and fairness. The question isn't whether the strong can dominate, they can. The question is what kind of society we want to build. One where might makes right, or one where justice and human dignity matter." These lessons planted seeds that would take years to fully grow. But the boys were receptive in ways they never could have been before the ice cream, before the walls came down, before they began seeing Americans as humans rather than enemies. By midsummer, the Red Cross had begun facilitating mail between prisoners and families in occupied Germany. The process was slow and uncertain. Many addresses no longer existed. Many families had been displaced or scattered, but gradually letters began connecting separated people. Klaus received word that his mother and younger sister had survived the fall of Berlin and were living with relatives in Bavaria. His father was unaccounted for, last known to be fighting on the Eastern Front, his fate uncertain. Klaus wrote back immediately, his German careful and precise, trying to explain where he was and what he had experienced. How could he make her understand what had happened? How could he convey in a letter that he had fought in the war's final days, been captured, transported across the Atlantic, and was now being held in a camp where guards gave prisoners ice cream? The whole thing sounded invented, impossible. He tried anyway. "Mother, I am safe. I am in America, in a camp by a large lake. They treat us well here, better than we were treated in the final days in Berlin. They give us food, teach us English, try to help us understand what happened and why. I am learning that much of what we were taught was not true. I am learning to see the world differently. I don't know when I will come home, but when I do, I will be different than when you last saw me. I hope you can accept who I am becoming." Hans wrote to his family in Hamburg, a letter that was more confession than update. "Father, I believed everything you and the government told me. I was proud to serve, but I was wrong. The beliefs we held were wrong. I am learning this now, and it is painful but necessary. I don't know what our country will become after this, but I hope it will be something better than what we had. I hope when I return, we can talk about this honestly." Ernst's letter to his father, who had quietly warned him to remember people were people first, was simpler. "You are right. Thank you for trying to tell me, even when it was dangerous to speak such truths." The letters that came back from Germany painted a picture of complete devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, families living in bombed-out buildings, food scarce, services collapsed, occupation forces struggling to manage millions of displaced and desperate people. The regime's promised 1,000-year empire had lasted 12 years and left Germany utterly destroyed. Reading these letters, the boys confronted the full magnitude of what their country had done and what had been done to it. The war they had fought in, believing it was defensive or necessary or glorious, had resulted in their homeland's utter devastation. Everything the regime had promised, strength, prosperity, dominance, had ended in ash and rubble. In late July, the camp administration organized a concert. A USO troop was passing through the region, and they agreed to perform at Camp Perry for both guards and prisoners. The German boys were invited to attend, seated in a section of the outdoor theater with guards nearby, but not restricting. The performers sang American songs, jazz standards, patriotic tunes, popular music from the war years. The boys listened with fascination to music they had never heard, styles that had been banned by the regime as decadent or corrupting. The energy of it, the joy embedded in rhythms and melodies, struck them as revelatory. One singer, a woman with a voice that seemed to carry across the entire camp, performed a song called "I'll Be Seeing You." The lyrics spoke of separation and longing, of remembering someone in all the familiar places, of faith that reunion would come eventually. Klaus, listening to words he only partially understood, but whose emotion transcended language, felt tears building again. He thought of his mother and sister in Bavaria, of whether he would see them again, of what kind of person he would be when that reunion finally came. He thought of his father, missing on the Eastern Front, likely dead in Russia's vast expanse. When the concert ended, and the prisoners were dismissed back to their barracks, the boys walked in contemplative silence. The music had touched something in them, had reminded them of beauty in art, and the human capacity to create rather than destroy. That evening, Ernst, who had sung in a choir before the war, began teaching the others a German folk song he remembered from childhood. It wasn't a military song or propaganda anthem, just a simple melody about spring flowers and new growth. The boys sang together quietly, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger, reclaiming something pure from their culture that had been buried under years of war. Mitchell, making his rounds, stopped outside Barracks 7 to listen. The sound of German boys singing a peaceful song while held prisoner in America created a strange, beautiful moment that felt somehow like the war was finally ending, not just officially, as it had in May, but emotionally, psychologically, in the hearts of boys learning to be something other than soldiers. As summer progressed toward autumn, The boys faced increasingly difficult questions about their futures. Germany was divided into occupation zones, its government dissolved, its society being rebuilt from the ground up. The regime's leaders would face tribunals. The country itself would need to confront what it had done during 12 years of dictatorship and 6 years of war. Major Caldwell led sessions where the boys discussed these issues. She didn't let them escape into comfortable distance or abstraction. She made them confront specifics. What did they know about the camps? About the persecution of certain groups? About the atrocities committed in their country's name? The answers varied. Some, like Klaus, had been too young and too sheltered to know much beyond propaganda's general hatred. Others, like Hans, had heard whispers, seen things, known more than they wanted to admit. All had participated in a system that led to unfathomable suffering, even if their individual roles were small. "I didn't know," Hans said during one session. Or ... I knew some things, but I didn't want to believe they were as bad as they were. I made excuses. I told myself the rumors were enemy propaganda. And now? Caldwell asked. Now I know I should have questioned more. Should have been brave enough to confront what my country was doing instead of just accepting what I was told. You were a child, Caldwell reminded him. Children believe authorities. Children follow orders. That doesn't excuse everything, but it matters for understanding. The adults who created this system, who gave orders, who designed the camps and planned the campaigns, they carry the primary responsibility. You carry the responsibility of remembering, of learning, of becoming someone who would never allow such things to happen again. These were hard sessions. The boys cried again, but differently and with the ice cream. These were tears of shame and recognition, of confronting complicity, even when that complicity was limited by youth and circumstance. They were tears of boys becoming men who would have to live with history. In mid-August, guards organized a baseball game between themselves and the German prisoners. Most of the boys had never seen baseball, knew nothing of its rules or strategy. The guards spent an afternoon teaching them how to hold the bat, how to catch, the basic principles of the game. Klaus discovered he had a natural talent for pitching. His thin arms could generate surprising speed, and his accuracy improved with each throw. Mitchell, catching for him during practice, marveled at how quickly the boy learned. The game itself was chaotic and joyful. The boys made mistakes, misunderstood rules, swung at terrible pitches, and missed easy catches. But they laughed, genuine, uninhibited laughter that seemed impossible given where they were and what they had experienced. Guards cheered for good plays on both sides. Prisoners celebrated hits with exuberant German exclamations that needed no translation. In the 7th inning, Klaus pitched to Mitchell. The guard had been teaching him an American curveball, a pitch that broke right before reaching the plate. Klaus wound up and threw with everything he had. The ball curved beautifully, and Mitchell swung too early, missing completely. Klaus pumped his fist in victory, then seemed to remember he was a prisoner celebrating against a guard. He stopped, uncertain, but Mitchell was already laughing and shaking his head in mock dismay. "That's it," Mitchell called out in German. "You've learned too well." The moment crystallized something important. These were just boys and young men playing a game on a summer afternoon. The war was over. The labels of enemy and captor still existed officially, but in this moment they felt almost meaningless. By September, word came that repatriation would begin soon. The boys would be returned to Germany, to whatever remained of their homes and families, to a country they would barely recognize. The prospect brought mixed emotions, relief at returning home, mixed with fear of what they would find, eagerness to reunite with families mixed with dread of conditions in occupied Germany. The education program intensified, as if instructors were trying to pack in everything they could before time ran out. The boys studied harder, knowing these lessons might be their only structured learning for months or years to come. Professor Herschel gave them a final lecture that felt more like a farewell address. You are returning to a Germany that must be rebuilt, not just physically but morally. You've seen a different way here, not perfect, but different. You've learned that democracy can work, that diversity can be strength, that people can govern themselves without a dictator. Take those lessons home. Remember them when others try to tell you that Germany needs a strong leader, that certain groups are to blame, that the old ways were better. Remember that you've seen the truth. The boys received care packages to take home clothes, food, small items that would be valuable in Germany's shortages. But more importantly, they received letters from their instructors and guards, documents attesting to their character, their learning, their transformation. These letters might help them navigate the complex politics of occupied Germany, might vouch for them when trust was scarce. Mitchell gave Klaus something personal, a baseball signed by everyone in the camp, guards and prisoners alike. Remember, Mitchell said, that enemies became friends. Remember that even after the worst war in history, people found ways to be kind to each other. Klaus held the baseball like it was precious beyond measure. "I will never forget," he said in English that had become fluent. "I will never forget the ice cream, the baseball, the way you saw me as a person. I will tell my children and my children's children." In early October, the boys boarded trucks that would take them to trains, that would take them to ships, that would carry them back across the Atlantic. The entire camp turned out to see them off guards, officers, support staff, even some prisoners from other barracks who had become friendly with these young Germans. Colonel Hayes addressed them one final time. "You came here as prisoners of war. You leave as young men who have learned and grown. We hope you'll use what you've learned here to help build a better Germany. We hope you'll remember that nations may be enemies, but people can always choose to see each other's humanity." The boys climbed into trucks with their meager belongings. Klaus, sitting in the back, looked at Camp Perry one last time, the barracks where he had learned English, the recreation yard where he had tasted ice cream and cried the baseball diamond, where he had learned an American game and discovered joy again. Mitchell stood at the fence, raising his hand in farewell. Klaus raised his back, holding the signed baseball, his eyes bright with tears that were both sad and grateful. As the trucks pulled away, the boys began singing again, not military songs, but the German folk song Ernst had taught them, the one about spring and new growth. The sound drifted back across Camp Perry, a strange and beautiful reminder that even in war's aftermath, even among former enemies, something human persisted. The boys returned to a Germany that was indeed barely recognizable. Cities lay in ruins, the economy had collapsed, millions were displaced, and the full horror of the regime's crimes was becoming undeniable as camps were documented and survivors began telling their stories. Klaus found his mother and sister in Bavaria, living in 2 rooms of a farmhouse they shared with 3 other families. His father was confirmed dead, lost in the retreat from Russia. Klaus enrolled in a school being established by American occupation forces, using the English he had learned at Camp Perry to work as a translator, helping bridge the gap between occupiers and occupied. He became, over the following decades, a teacher. He taught English and American history in German schools, always emphasizing the importance of questioning authority, of recognizing propaganda, of maintaining moral courage, even when it was difficult. He kept the signed baseball in his classroom, and when students asked about it, he told them about Camp Perry, about ice cream that made him cry, about American guards who treated enemies with dignity. Hans returned to Hamburg and found his family's home destroyed. His father, who had been a mid-level official in the regime, was imprisoned by British occupation authorities and later faced a tribunal. Hans testified honestly about what he had learned in America, about recognizing the lies he had been taught. He went on to study law, eventually working in Germany's new democratic government, always carrying the memory of transformation in an Ohio prisoner camp. Ernst became a musician, finding in music the beauty and connection he had glimpsed during that USO concert. He performed throughout Europe, jazz and classical and experimental compositions, always believing that art could transcend national boundaries and speak to shared humanity. Of the 17 boys who had cried over ice cream in June 1945, most survived the difficult early years of post-war Germany and became productive citizens of the democratic nation that eventually emerged. They married, had children, built careers, grew old in a Germany that learned from its terrible history. And they remembered. In letters and conversations, in classrooms and living rooms, they told the story of American guards who gave German prisoners ice cream, who treated children like children rather than enemies, who showed kindness when cruelty would have been justified. They told the story because it mattered, because it demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, people could choose humanity over hatred. The story of German child prisoners crying over ice cream seems almost too simple to carry significant meaning. Ice cream is trivial, mundane, a frozen dessert that melts in minutes. But in that Ohio camp in June 1945, it became something else, a catalyst for transformation, a symbol of possible futures, a gift that said, "You are seen, you are valued, you deserve sweetness." Those 17 boys were shaped by forces beyond their control. They were educated in propaganda, conscripted into a losing war, used as cannon fodder in a desperate final defense. They could have been treated with the harshness their country's actions might have justified. Instead, they were given ice cream by guards who chose to see children rather than enemies. The crying that followed wasn't weakness or manipulation. It was breakthrough the sudden overwhelming recognition that propaganda had been lies, that the world contained possibilities they had never been allowed to imagine, that even after the worst war in human history, kindness still existed. Major Caldwell's psychological insight had been correct. Sometimes the most powerful intervention is the simplest gift, offered without condition, given freely to people who expect nothing but harshness. The ice cream broke through defenses that arguments and evidence never could have penetrated, reached the children underneath the soldier training, reminded them that they were human beings capable of joy. The guards who cried watching the boys cry weren't being sentimental or weak. They were responding to the profound sadness of children forced to become soldiers, of childhood stolen by adults who should have protected them, of years lost to a war these boys didn't start and couldn't stop. They cried because in that moment they saw clearly what the war had done to an entire generation, and they recognized their own capacity for compassion despite everything the war had tried to teach about hating enemies. When Klaus kept that signed baseball for 70 years, when he showed it to students and told them about Camp Perry, he was passing forward the lesson that had been given to him, that people can choose to be better than their worst moments, that enemies can become friends, that kindness has power that violence never achieves. The ice cream melted in minutes. The memory lasted lifetimes. And a lesson that even in war's aftermath, even between former enemies, human connection and compassion remain possible. That lesson was carried forward by 17 German boys who learned in an American prison camp that the world could be different than propaganda had promised. They were child soldiers who became children again, for just a moment, through the simple gift of something cold and sweet and good. And in that moment of transformation, something shifted not just in those 17 individuals, but in the very possibility of what could come after war, what could be built from ruins, what kind of future was possible if people chose compassion over cruelty. The war had tried to teach them to hate. Ice cream taught them they could still feel joy. And that contradiction, that simple, profound contradiction, helped them become men who would spend their lives working to ensure such wars never happened again.